What can Willie Green learn from Jason Kidd? How do the Celtics and Mavs change how we view team building? The NBA Finals start this week, and there are big lessons to learn. It's the Tuesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Tuesday. The NBA Finals start this week, so let's take a look at the Celtics, the Mavericks, their head coaches, their players. What lessons can we learn from this that apply to the New Orleans Pelicans? Because there's a lot, right? Betting on talent and trying to acquire good talent for your team is a big one. That's why the Mavs are here. You also need growth from your head coaches. I'll talk about how Jason Kidd has grown, some of the traits that Willie Green has and then other traits that he needs to go and get. And we'll kind of look at the role players too, because the Celtics are an interesting study in that. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and available on YouTube as well, where there's over 10,000 Pelicans fans, and become an everyday. Listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. And if you are an everyday, let me know in the comments down below. So let's start with talent. The Pelicans are looking at shaking up their roster, potentially breaking up the pairing of Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson. Is that the right move? Is it not? One of the things that I've looked at when you're looking at a Brandon Ingram trade, and we're going to talk more about the Sacramento Kings on Thursday, but I was just on the Locked On Kings podcast on Monday, and we talked about how I don't see the Pelicans making a trade there, as a bit of a spoiler alert, if you're not going to get De'Aaron Fox back in a deal, because I don't think the Pelicans are that interested in trading Brandon Ingram. I don't want to say for parts, but for role players, not for top-end talent. So Harrison Barnes and Kevin Huerter as kind of like the core package of a trade. If that's what you're going to get, just keep Brandon Ingram. But if you can go out and get star talent, star-level players, that I think is worth doing. And that's when you look to the Atlanta Hawks for DeJounte Murray, for Trae Young. That's when you look to the Cleveland Cavaliers. Garland, kind of. Donovan Mitchell, for certain. That's the type of stuff that you need to win at an NBA level. And you look at the Dallas Mavericks, and they're there because of Luka Doncic, but also because of Kyrie Irving, a guy that they took a big risk on and traded for, and it worked out really, really well for them, and now they're in the finals here. At the time, back in February of 2023, that was a real risky move. The value was at kind of an all-time low for Kyrie Irving after his stint with the Brooklyn Nets that just did not go well whatsoever. Didn't really play. There was just a lot of issues about personality, fit. Is he a good teammate? All of those things. And Dallas is like, look, we got to get top-end talent in here. We're going to try and make a move for him. And they did. And look at how it's paying just phenomenal dividends for them right now in the NBA Finals. There's parallels here. The Dallas Mavericks have taken risks, just straight up risks, to assemble the team that they have and get where they are. The Pelicans have been a little bit risk adverse the past couple of years. There was risk at times in trading for CJ McCollum, certainly, but not as big as the Dallas Mavericks. But when you look at it this offseason, there's some risky players out there. Could you trade for Donovan Mitchell not knowing if he'd sign an extension with you and you could potentially lose him in a year? That's a risk. Would it be worth it? Quite possibly. Trae Young has a lot of some of the same questions around him as Kyrie Irving. Is he a good teammate, right? Committed to defense? Maybe. Talented offensive player? Yes. But, is he a ball hog? Does he need the ball in his hands? All of those things are kind of big question marks. But look, for a small market team that wants to just win, maybe it depends on what you want to do. If you just want to get into the playoffs every year, get some playoff gate revenue from the arena and go home, you can do that. But if you want to try and win an NBA title, particularly in the Western Conference where all these teams are good or only going to try and be getting better, you need to be more aggressive potentially. You have to take those risks, right? And that might mean getting fired. The people making these decisions, if it doesn't work out, you lose your job. That's not an ideal thing. But if you want to win an NBA title, there's risk involved and you've just got to kind of go for it. And it feels like if the Pelicans were going to do that, this offseason is it. And so the reason I say this is if you want to remake your roster in a significant way, Trae Young's the biggest name you could probably put. I'm going to say Donovan Mitchell ends up re-signing with the Cavaliers and isn't going to get moved. But Trae Young, if you could pry him away from the Atlanta Hawks in a Brandon Ingram deal, that feels like the type of thing that you should try and do or need to do. And maybe if the Dallas Mavericks win the finals, or even then just making the finals, maybe gives more credence to a move like that. Maybe you look at that and go, yes, that's a blueprint here, and look at the success that they've had because of it. It was a risk. We weren't sure. And then that team tanked last year too, got the other player they needed, more on role players in the third segment here. And actually kind of when it comes to Derek Lively in the second segment here too, you need to kind of take those risks. And I think it's time for the Pelicans to try and do it. Does it blow up and not work? Yeah, possibly. It didn't look good for the Mavericks last year. Kyrie kind of shut down during the stretch run there. They lost games on purpose, shut Luka down, tried to kind of just keep their pick, draft someone, and then kind of come back strong this year. And it worked. And it turns out that you didn't need a ton of those games last year between Kyrie and Luka to build the chemistry and those things. They were also injured to start the year. They didn't really play in the preseason as much as you would have liked. Just get top end talent, and over time it will figure itself out. And I definitely think there's a lesson there for the Pelicans to look at. You've seen that maybe Ingram and Zion Williamson don't exactly work. More on that in the third segment here. And get a guy that's going to fit. Just get a guy that's going to fit, or that's going to be a top-end talent that can help carry you. Trae Young, to me, is that guy. I think Murray can be a good fit with that, too. But to me, it's really, really all about Trae Young, and that's kind of my number one guy. We'll eventually have a show. It'll probably be on Friday, kind of the idealized, at least my version, Pelicans off-season. We'll get into that in the Friday episode of Locked On Pelicans, and I think that's going to be a real fun show, and I'm excited for that. So that's going to be a fun one. But you've got to take risks. The Mavericks did, and now they're in the NBA Finals. And even if they don't win, that's a good season. That's a very, very good season. Another reason they've had a very good season is you've seen a lot of coaching growth from Jason Kidd. Willie Green has a lot of traits that Jason Kidd has. Let's look at that and see what he needs to add and how Jason Kidd has grown, because he was a failure earlier on, and he was on the hot seat going into this year. Let's take a look at what Willie Green can learn from Jason Kidd. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. It's the NBA Finals. The Pelicans aren't in it, unfortunately. But you want to make the game more interesting? Tell me what you think about the -5.5 line for the Boston Celtics. They're 5.5-point favorites. Is Dallas going to win this game outright? Are they going to keep it closer than 5.5 points? This is a chance for you to use your sports knowledge. Go make the games a little bit more interesting. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And again, that's $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We are also available on YouTube as well, where there's over 10,000 Pelicans fans. And tell a friend about the show. We're covering the draft, trade talk, free agency, lessons to be learned, not just yelling, things like that on the show, just giving you the sports talk, Pelicans talk that you want. So subscribe wherever you get your podcast. For your second listen, go check out Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast. He and I were planning out a bunch of shows over the weekend, actually. There'll be some crossovers over this summer and everything. It's going to be a lot of fun. Get up to date on all the OTAs and everything you need to know about the Black and Gold. Locked On Saints host Ross Jackson. So let's switch gears to coaching. Willie Green is not, I've said this a long time. If you're an everyday or a longtime listener, you know what this little spiel is. 5 coaches make a difference. 5 coaches hurt you. And then there's 20 coaches in the middle that are just like, blah, whatever. Willie Green's in that middle part, right? I don't think they actively harm or hurt you when you look at it over the course of the season. They might make a decision in a game that costs you the win, but they're also doing things that elevate the team a little bit too. Look at Jason Kidd. This is his third time being a head coach. Head coach of the Brooklyn Nets, and it was a disaster. Head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks was fired mid-season. Now he comes to the Dallas Mavericks, makes a conference finals his first year. They tanked last year, but he was on the hot seat going into this season, and he delivered here. I wouldn't put him as one of the top 5 coaches in the league, but I think when you look at that kind of middle 20 guys, he's in that top 5 to 10 of those. So he's a top 15 coach in the league, probably between 15 and like 6, somewhere in that range. Not a bad spot to be in. And when you have star talent, top level talent, like we just talked about, that can get you pretty far. And it has here. But you look at some of the things he's done wrong early on in his career, and you see some parallels with Willie Green here, with his struggles with the Nets, with the Bucks, right? Part of it was just stubbornness, a seemingly lack of like tactical adjustments and things like that. Relying on older players too. All things that we've kind of talked about with Willie Green. But, coaches improve just like players do. And sometimes it's not always that like linear progression that you would like. Sometimes it just takes a little bit to figure it out. If you think Jason Kidd is one of the top coaches in the league, he hasn't always been that way. But now he's finally in a position where maybe he's learned from some of these mistakes. He's adapted, he's grown, he's adjusted. And he's doing a really good job. Like when you look at his coaching in the playoffs, some of the minute details, just winning all of his challenges pretty much, being really good about that. You're also seeing him find ways to kind of sneak extra rest for Kyrie Irving, for Jason Kidd, for Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, through strategic use of timeouts and things like that. That's all really great. And Willie Green needs to learn from some of that, should be watching this and kind of seeing what Jason Kidd is doing, what he's challenging, how is he kind of thinking? And if Willie Green can do that and can adopt some of these things, he can be better. This team won 49 games. And like early on with the Mavs, it does feel like the Pelicans with Willie Green, they were kind of winning with like the talent, almost in spite of their head coach at times, though I don't think that's fully the case with the Pelicans. But was the head coach doing a ton to truly, truly elevate them? Jason Kidd earlier on with the Mavericks, even early on this season with the Mavericks, was not. And maybe that was some experimenting, some trying some different things out. But in the playoffs, he's kind of been locked in. And that's what we're hoping to see from Willie Green this season. And look, Jason Kidd has proven that it can happen. Now they definitely have more of an identity, and it's not just, okay, I'm going to give the ball to Luka Doncic. Luka, go and win us the game. It's what it feels like at times here in New Orleans. Hey, Zion, just go do your Zion thing. There's a much more cohesive team. I couldn't tell you what their offensive identity is. You kind of see what they do, but would you call that an offensive identity? I'm not really sure. I think kind of looking at that is a little bit overrated at times. I think you just have good players and you're deploying them well. That's not necessarily an identity. But they are doing a significantly better job, or Dallas and their coaching staff is, than they were before, and that's just growth. One of the things when it comes to Jason Kidd that I think is stunning a little bit this year is how much trust there's been in a guy like Derek Lively II. They essentially tanked to get him, got the exact type of player that they needed, and he has done a very, very good job. He's a rookie out of Duke, and played a significant role this season. He started 42 games, played in 55 in the regular season, playing almost 24 minutes per game as a rookie. And when you look at him in the postseason, he's coming off the bench. They're starting Daniel Gafford. But Gafford's plus minus has been bad. And I don't think you'll really see him play nearly as much as Lively II will in this series. For a head coach in kind of a make or break year, he got in his extension after the second round of the playoffs, or after the first round of the playoffs, whenever it was. So he was still a little bit at risk and needed to prove it. And then he did. To trust a rookie, you get where I'm going with this, right? That's a pretty impressive thing. And that's something that Willie Green is going to need to do next season. He's going to need to trust these younger players a little bit more than he has. You're going to probably have to play Jordan Hawkins more than the 17.3 minutes per game. Right? It's almost 8 minutes, 7 minutes fewer, whatever it is, than Derek Lively, and Hawkins was probably pretty needed at times. Though again, I don't think he's as good or as impactful as Lively was, partially because Lively was at like more of a position of need and kind of gaping hole opportunity for the Dallas Mavericks. But this goes back to the time with Trey Murphy. And when you look at the Pelicans with the 21st overall pick, and they're likely going to draft a big man there, more on that on Friday, you're going to need to play that big man. Doesn't matter. You're just going to need to play him. It's as simple as that. So trusting that your front office gives you the players is important. Jason Kidd talked about that, recently during the postseason, saying like, we had a plan here. We were, on the same page. David Griffin would probably use the word lockstep with something like this. The front office knew what Jason Kidd needed, and they went out and got it in Derek Lively, in Daniel Gafford, in PJ Washington. They added those pieces, and that was really important. If Willie Green needs another type of player, the front office needs to work with him to make sure they're getting those type of guys, or just telling him what to do. Either one. But no matter what, there's going to be, barring it being included in a Brandon Ingram deal, probably a rookie big man on this team next year. Feels safe to say that right now. You're going to need to play him. There's no starting center right now. Your center is Larry Nance Jr. That's it. You need to know that you're going to play this guy and make sure that the front office gets the right one. And then when they do, you've got to play him. Jordan Hawkins is the right piece to add to this team. I said at draft night that might be the best fit. And it's true. I stand by that. Even if he wasn't going to be the best player, he was going to be the best fit for what his skill set was, putting it around Zion, around Brandon Ingram. You got to play him, though. And that was the issue. So watching Jason Kidd grow is important. One of the things Jason Kidd did early on in his career that I think was what you see Willie Green doing is getting these role players to buy in. That's not always the easiest thing to do. You see the role players very much into what their role, what their job is, and just understanding their place within the team on the Dallas Mavericks. I actually think you get a lot of that here in New Orleans. This whole team fights hard. Look at guys like Najee Marshall, Jose Alvarado, right? Trey Murphy off the bench kind of knowing his role. Even Larry Nance Jr. knowing his role off the bench. All of those guys go out and hustle and play hard for the head coach. That's not always the easiest thing to do. So to be able to kind of get the buy-in, particularly on the defensive side of the ball with that, a lot of that I think is Herb Jones, but Willie Green getting Zion to buy in a little bit more defensively, even though Zion's publicly giving the credit to Herb Jones. Getting Brandon Ingram to buy in more defensively than he ever has been before. That's all good. It's time to just kind of grow and adapt and like level up in a sense as a head coach. And if Willie Green can do that, the pieces are here for this team to be significantly better next year. And that can definitely start with the head coach. Watching, Jason Kidd kind of understand this roster fully, have full faith in all of the guys, which Willie Green doesn't on this team, knowing exactly who to put in, knowing when to challenge plays, knowing how to get extra rest for his guys. That's all been pretty impressive. Those are things that Willie Green and the coaching staff should be watching. And I think there's an opportunity for them to grow and improve. But the Mavericks being in the finals, because of Jason Kidd's growth as a head coach, shows that there's hope at least, potential for Willie Green to do the same. But you also need the right role players around. And that's where we're going to turn to the Boston Celtics, because there were a lot of cries to blow up that team. But they saw what they had in Jayson Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and it was other tweaks that made the difference. Let's look at that and how the Pelicans could, approach the offseason with that in mind. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Look, we all carry around different stressors, big or small, and when we keep them bottled up, it can just start to affect us negatively. So therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever's weighing you down. Life doesn't come with an instruction manual. Maybe you're dealing with the death of a loved one, or a tough time at work, or something's wrong in your relationship. How you get through that is going to be different for everybody, and you don't always know the path forward. And that's where therapy can help. Getting a third-party neutral observer of your life in there to give you that kind of advice and help you work through things can make your life better. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge either. So get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. It's going to get you 10% off your first month. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We are here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And tell a friend about the show. Make them become an everydayer, which means you listen Monday through Friday. Do you see the parallels between Jason Kidd and Willie Green? Do you think there's another head coach that Willie Green reminds you of? Or in your opinion, is Willie Green just the worst? Where do you rank him just in the league? 1 through 30. Put a number on him. Where would you rank Willie Green as a head coach? I'm kind of curious about that now. So we've talked about the Mavericks a lot because I think they're kind of the team closest to the Pelicans, right? You know, they kind of broke up their team, went through a slight little mini retool in the middle of last season, bringing in Kyrie Irving, kind of built around their main guy in Luka Doncic. Their head coach grew. There's a lot of parallels there. And then we get to the Boston Celtics. Different, and this is an approach that the Pelicans could emulate as well. This team has been so close for so long and not gotten over the hump at all. And because of their costs, because of how expensive that team is, they're going to be pushing the second apron. We talked about that in a show the other day, if you're an everydayer, why that's bad. There have been a lot of calls to trade one of Jayson Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and to break those guys up. You have those two together, and you haven't been able to get over the hump. You lost in the finals before. You've made the conference finals a lot of success, but no ultimate championship. That's why there's a lot for both those guys in terms of their legacies at stake. There's a whole lot just in terms of legacies at stake in this series, no matter what. But particularly for them, I think, they lose this. No one's going to believe they're going to get over the hump. And that's because the role players around them are real good. Really, really good. When you look at Boston and see how deep they are and the level of players they have around them, the quality of players they have around them, it is just flat out impressive how much talent is on that team. And there's a reason why they won the Eastern Conference by 14 games. They won 64 games. The number 2 seed, the New York Knicks, won 50. Pelicans won 49 by comparison. The top seed in the West won 57 games. That's still 7 games above them. That's how dominant Boston was this season. They clinched their playoff spot. They clinched the number 1 seed before anyone had officially clinched a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference, maybe even the entire NBA, actually. There's a lot of talent there. So one, Boston has been aggressive, trading future first-round picks and things like that to go and get said talent, right? Trading for Drew Holiday, trading for Kristaps Porzingis, bringing Al Horford back, trading for Derek White, who ended up being an amazing acquisition for them this season. They've been aggressive with the right role players, but they easily could have split up Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum and traded one of those guys and tried something different. But they believed in that pairing together, and then they went out and just put better role players around them. There is some similarities to the Pelicans here with that. If you believe in that pairing of Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson, don't trade them and instead kind of go in a way that Dave Griffin hinted at in his end-of-season media availability, wondering if they just haven't put the right players around them. If Tatum and Brown win the title this year, a lot of it's going to be, well, you had to get them the right role players. It's the case for any stars, right? It's going to be how much talent around them does it take for them to win a title because they're not good enough by themselves or something like that. And sure, I get it. But at the same point, no, every team needs talented role players to really help them out and to try and kind of accomplish the ultimate goal, which is to win an NBA title. So if you are the Pelicans and you go, we haven't had the right center, we haven't had enough shooting, even though they have and they don't play it, right? You go and get those guys and then see. Don't trade Brandon Ingram for parts. More on that when we talk about the Sacramento Kings potential deal on Thursday's Trade Target Thursday show here on Locked On Pelicans, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That's what Boston's doing. They said, no, we're not going to do a massive shakeup. We'll send out kind of a fan favorite guy, team favorite guy in Marcus Smart. We'll bring in Drew Holiday. Okay. We'll bring in Kristaps Porzingis, who we think is going to be a better big man, better suited to the style of play that we want. They've been proven correct by all of that. We'll see if they can ultimately win the finals from it, but they've done a very good job of adding what they needed to add, it feels like. So the Pelicans could look at that too, if you believe that it's more the role players around Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson than the pairing of Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson themselves. Tatum is a two-way guy. Jaylen Brown is a two-way guy. They can both shoot threes. They can both score. They can both dish assists. Defense, the rebounding for those guys is pretty decent as well. If you think you have the right pairing in Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram, keep them and work on the role players and see if that elevates you kind of to what the Boston Celtics did. Because look, if the Celtics traded, and we have hindsight in this, but if they traded one of those two guys, would they be here? Would they have won 64 games, 14 games ahead of the number 2 seed in the Eastern Conference? Probably not. Also helps they have a very good head coach too, who has a lot of basketball IQ and tactical acumen. So if you don't get the right deal for Brandon Ingram, don't just trade him for scraps, 30 cents on the dollar. Then focus on a really impactful center that maybe you're not going to get otherwise. Go after a Miles Turner then, someone like that. Make them an offer they can't refuse when it comes to the draft picks and things that you have. That's maybe the direction the Pelicans could go. The Celtics are kind of an example of that. The Dallas Mavericks are an example of it on the other side of things. And we get to see them play in the playoffs and maybe see which one comes out on top, which makes this series, for me, a really interesting thing to watch. Do you have of the two teams, the Mavs, the Celtics, let me know your predictions here. But also, do you have a preferred team building way? Look at the way they did things differently. Which direction do you think the Pelicans should go? Do you think you have a preference for one team building strategy over the other? I'm kind of curious. Let me know in the comments down below. So coming up tomorrow, we're going to look at kind of the history of the 17th pick and a couple picks around there too. How often do those guys turn into star players, starter players, MVP level players? What are the chances of the Pelicans drafting an impactful player there, essentially? I'll tell you what that is in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans. That's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and I'll see y'all tomorrow.